Hi, could you just give us your name and your background?
My name is Roy Rush. I was born in The Hague, Holland, or the Netherlands. I am, however, not actually Dutch. I am of a different extraction. My parents were born both in Indonesia, or as it was called, the Dutch East Indies back in the 30s and 40s. That was a part of the Dutch colonies.
Are your parents 100% Indonesian?
No, they're not. I have a grandmother who is Sri Lankan. I have a grandmother who is actually Indonesian. Both my great grandfathers are Swiss, and my grandfathers are from Indonesia.
So your grandfathers, both your mother's and your father's fathers, are half Indonesian, half Swiss.
That is correct.
And your father is uh, a quarter Indonesian, a quarter Swiss, and half Sri Lankan.
That is correct. It
And
does
you,
get complicated.
yes, and your mother is half Indonesian, half Swiss. No, 3/4 Indonesian because her mother was Indonesian.
That is correct.
And her father was half Indonesian, half Swiss.
That is correct.
So that makes you 3/4 or half Indonesian, a quarter Sri Lankan, and a quarter Swiss.
Correct.
Okay, go on, and continue. So your parents were born in Indonesia.
Yes. And so they were born right before the Second World War started, 1919 to be exact. And with the Second World War, Japanese invaded Indonesia at that time. Without going into a lengthy explanation of what happened, both my parents, ended up meeting each other through the war, falling in love and getting married, and ending up in Japanese internment camps.
Because the Japanese occupied Indonesia during World War II.
That is correct. The idea there was that Japanese was taking Indonesia first, that as a first step, and then they were supposed to move on to Australia and invade Australia. That never actually happened.
Okay, one moment. I just got to adjust the camera. Okay. And so when World War II ended, what happened?
So when World War II ended, the Japanese capitulated, obviously, and but rather than wait for the occupying forces, which would have been the British and the Dutch, to show up to help liberate the nation, what they did instead is they just left. And at that time, brewing within the nation was the communist movement, communist slash Muslim movement that was growing, that was practicing a ethnic cleansing. And what they were doing was they were removing anybody that was not purebred Indonesian from the island.
Which was everybody in your family,
Correct.
except your grandmother.
Right. And so the way that worked was is they would go house by house, kill whole families if they were actually Indonesian. So at some point there was negotiations made, and
There were
there were
negotiations.
negotiations made, and several large ships were sent to the island of Java. And if you were of mixed extraction, you were allowed to get on that ship and get out.
But your family was actually spared miraculously.
Yes, they were.
And that was the intervention of our Lord God.
Oh, absolutely, it was. Yes.
Okay. But some of your family, your mom and dad's cousins, were murdered.
Actually, almost everybody in my family was murdered by the Japanese.
But your parents and your grandparents were spared.
They were spared,
And your aunt.
and my aunts, some of my aunts, not all of them. So as a result, I don't know much of my family because most of them were not around by the time I was born anymore.
Okay, so let's go back to the agreement of the people with mixed extraction.
So they got put on this ship, or several ships. My parents and my grandparents were all on the same ship, with my brother who had been born in 1945 while traveling through in a half track on his way to the hospital.
A Japanese internment hospital.
Yeah, and so they were on the ship, and at that time there was no country that was willing to accept refugees from Indonesia. So the ship set out to sea, not knowing really where it was going, but they headed towards Europe because they assumed that that's where they would end up. And as they were going through the Suez Canal, they finally got notice from the country of the Netherlands that said, we'll take this ship and all its occupants.
Well, wasn't Indonesia a Dutch colony at that time?
It was, but you have to remember, half of Europe was in ravages itself because of the Second World War. And
So that's why the hesitation.
right, nobody was really in any state to accept anybody.
Gotcha.
But because it was coming from Indonesia, the Dutch said that they would take that ship because it had Indonesian or Dutch East Indian people on it. And so that's where they went. And they got to Holland, where after my parents were in Holland for a while, my older brother and myself were born. I was born in The Hague at that time.
Now, Holland is an extremely different climate than what your parents were used to.
Correct. You have to remember, Java is a very tropical island.
And Holland is very cold.
Holland is very stark and very cold and lots of snow, something that they had never experienced. And so from the moment they got there, they started to look for something that was more tropical.
And
So Holland had at that time some colonies, 6 islands in the Caribbean. And so they looked at that, and my dad actually went ahead and checked it out. And there was a company.
I apologize for the camera moving. I'm trying to get it angled so I can hold it without my arm dying. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Okay. And there was a company that my dad is a electromechanical engineer.
Was.
Yes, he's passed away since. But he found a company that needed his services, and they happened to be in Curacao, which is a small island right near Venezuela.
And it's part of the ABC Islands.
It's part of it. At that time it was called the Netherlands Antilles, and it's part of the ABC Islands: Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao. Most people know Aruba. Not too many people know Curacao or Bonaire. But they ended up in Curacao.
And this is when you were 11 months old.
Correct. I was born in 52. I was there. We got there in 53.
Okay. And you lived there until 1970 when you were 18 years old.
Correct.
So you basically, for your entire life, until your adulthood, you grew up in Curacao.
I did.
Okay, so now tell us what it was like on Curacao as you were growing up.
Well, Curacao is a unique island, I think, because it at that time, and I think still has, pretty close to 40 to 50 different nationalities living there, from all over the world. So when I grew up, my neighbor was a kid from Guyana. The neighbor next to him was a kid from Curacao, a black kid. And all of us just grew up together. It was one of those old Mayberry type locations where as long as I grew up, I remember walking the neighborhood. We're talking about many, many blocks, walking through the neighborhood, playing in somebody's yard, playing with kids. Everybody knew everybody. If a neighbor 4 blocks down, if you were walking by and said, "Hey, we're having snacks, come on in," you just walk in and eat. And it was perfectly safe and perfectly fine to do so.
And even as a very young child, you could walk around the island by yourself without any danger.
Yes, and we did.
So you basically lived in Leave It to Beaver.
Yeah, better. It was really. I've heard a comedian once say this. That if you walked in the neighborhood, that it's kind of like having your parents all over the place because everybody knew everybody. So if 6 houses down, my neighbor saw me doing something bad, by the time I got home, my parents knew it. And any neighbor was allowed to actually, spank me or punish me if I was doing something bad, as vice versa my parents could do with other kids. We were all taking care of each other. We were all looking out for each other. And it was a wonderful experience to grow up in.
What was the drug and alcohol situation in Curacao when you were growing up?
There was none.
Nobody was abusing drugs. Nobody was
No,
abusing.
there
Was
was
there
no.
an age limit for alcohol?
No, that's a funny thing. Curacao never had an age limit, or so you could drink if you wanted to, but there was no stigma about it. So it was not one of those things where, oh, I got to try this.
So there weren't a whole lot of alcoholics or drug addicts on the island.
Now, drugs, there were never any drugs until the late '60s,
And by then you were in the United States almost.
almost. Um, and we'll get to that in a minute.
But even then, when the late 60s came along in Curacao, it wasn't a problem.
No, no, it was never really a problem. Some kids, when I was a teenager, in my 14, 15, 16 years old, we had heard about it, obviously because it was at the drug culture was growing in the States and in Europe, and so we had some knowledge of what was going on. There wasn't a lot of influence in the islands because it is a faraway island, and not much reached over there. Um, but we heard about it, and obviously there was some experimentation going on, as kids tend to do.
But it wasn't any big deal.
No, it was never a big deal. It wasn't prevalent, and we had the normal parties like everybody else has.
I just got kicked by a dog.
Um, as a teenager in high school, we had our regular high school parties. I was part of a band that would play at this party.
But there wasn't excesses going on. There weren't excesses going on.
Everybody was just having a great time.
Well, let me ask you, who was your best friend your whole life growing up in Curacao?
Well, I had this guy, this kid next door to me called Frank Rosina, who I grew up with.
Frankie.
Frankie. And we hung out at each other's homes all the time. I actually had a little crush on one of his sisters growing up. And he was my best friend. We went to school from, well, we didn't have, when I went, I'm so old that there was no kindergarten when I went to school. But from first grade on up through high school, we were always in the same classes together. We always were in school together. We rode to school together. We came home from school together. I mean, I was closer to Frankie than I was to actually my own brothers.
So you did everything with Frankie.
Oh yeah, he was a great kid, a great guy.
And Frankie was white or black?
Well, that's funny. Frankie is black, or was black. He has passed away since now.
But you didn't know that, did you? Or notice it?
All my growing up, I had never noticed that there was a difference between either one of us or anybody that looked like him or anybody that looked like me. I didn't realize there were differences.
Well, you were considered, now you lived for a year in Holland because your grandparents stayed in Holland.
Correct.
And you would go there and visit, and you went there for 6 months 1 year and 6 months another year.
Correct.
So your appearance, you were a little darker then.
I was actually quite a bit darker. I was probably what somebody would call coffee with almost no milk.
Okay, so when you would go to Holland and live there for the year that you lived there, how are you treated by the native
And that's funny because that's when I was first went there. I was like 6 years old, and then again I was 14 years old, and I actually had never known a difference until I came to the Netherlands, and I was sitting in this tram. My mom and I were in the tram, and I forget where we were going, but we sat on the one side of the tram, and everybody that was sitting on that side moved over to the other side. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't understand it, but my mom explained it later. She said, they're just doing that because you're a little different.
Well, so was she, but
but I mean, I had no clue what that actually meant. Mind you, just growing up on the islands where nobody made a difference between what you looked like. You were just one of the people.
Okay, so that's the point I was going to make. You were Indonesian for the most part.
Yes, that's my darker skin.
And a little darker, but Frankie was black.
Correct.
Very dark.
Yes.
And there were people of all different colors and hues and races and on the island. Did anybody on the island in any of in all 18 years that you lived there, did you ever experience any situations where white people treated the darker people bad, or the darker people treated the whiter people bad? Did you experience any real overt racism while you were there?
There was no racism until the.
Well, okay, and that's what I was going to ask. You didn't, in 18 years, you didn't experience
No,
that.
I had no clue what it meant.
Okay, so.
Which I want to put that in perspective for a second, because we weren't living in a vacuum. So in the United States, in the mid '60s and a little bit later, you guys in the United States was having
The Watts riots,
riots
and all that.
and things like that.
And you saw it on the
And
news.
we would see that on TV. And for us, that was totally foreign. We had no clue what that meant.
Or why.
And couldn't understand why everybody was getting so excited or fighting over things and all that stuff. Until 67.
And that's what I wanted to know. What happened in 1967 in Curacao?
So, in that, with the advent in the United States of the Black Power movement and the Black Panther movement, the Black Panthers eventually sent emissaries all across the Caribbean, including Curacao. And there was a political party. You have to remember that Curacao had a political system kind of like the British, where you have many parties and then they select a group of people.
So it's a democracy rather than a republic.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
And there was an emerging party called the NPH, which was a nationalistic party, which I now in retrospect realize was a socialist party. And the Black Panthers, for some reason, decided that that was the ones they were going to talk to. And they associated themselves with that. And all of a sudden, we were hearing things in the news of how badly us whites, the white people in Curacao, were treating the blacks, which was, again, a surprise to all of us, only because
you weren't.
Curacao in the mid-50s had been given, Curacao at one point was a colony of the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
But in the mid-50s, they were giving autonomy with self-government. So by the time the 60s rolled around, our governor, our ministers, and most of the large government offices were all housed and headed up by natives, black people. Which again, we didn't see that as such.
They're just people on the island that deserve the offices.
That's exactly right. They were just, the island was giving its autonomy, and the island people took over.
So the Black Panthers basically instilled the idea in all of the people on the island that they were being oppressed by their government and by the white people.
Exactly.
Even though the government was island natives that were black.
And to this party that I was just talking about, NVP actually, not NPH. To them, this was great because this gave them a foothold to get some power. They weren't really a party that anybody was looking at because we were all very happy.
Right.
We didn't feel that there was a problem. But when the Black Panther came in, it gave them, first of all, they gave them money. So they had funds all of a sudden to use and make themselves known. And they got louder and louder and louder and
what happened in 1968?
Well, it all grew up to a giant blow up, at which point there were, in the middle of town, there were all these riots all of a sudden.
Buildings burning.
Actually, you have to remember, Curaçao's city there is a huge tourist attraction, or was at that time. And the big part of that is that we had all this very quaint European Danish style buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that, and I do mean all of that, was burned down. The whole downtown of Curacao was burned down.
By whom? By the Black Panthers or by the people who lived there?
By the people that they riled up to do their bidding.
And the people that they riled up were people that, prior to the Black Panthers coming there, were happy.
Yeah, you have to remember that the standard of living in Curacao was actually quite good.
Because it was a Dutch colony.
Well, because it was Dutch colony, but because we were a very busy tourist attraction. There was a lot of money flowing into the island from tourism.
And you guys were very well educated on the island.
Oh, yes. The Dutch education system is top notch. It really is.
And you guys had to learn 5 languages from first grade on up.
All of us did, yes.
So by the time you all graduated, you all could speak 5 languages, including, well, 6 if you include the native language of Papiamento.
Correct.
Okay. So it was a very well-educated island.
Oh, yes.
And yet the people were convinced all of a sudden by the Black Panthers, and then, of course, pushed by the socialist, communist government. They created unrest,
right.
And then they swooped in and said, well, we'll fix it.
Yeah.
And
exactly
Curacao is now what?
Well, Curacao, I mean, they rebuilt eventually. The city has been rebuilt. They tried to make it look as best as they could, like the old city. But it never recovered its atmosphere.
It lost its innocence.
Oh, absolutely it did, yes. It never came back to what it used to be. It was obviously now a child that had fully grown up and had tasted the seamier side of life
and power,
and they liked the power, and unfortunately it's still a fairly okay country, but now we're having influences from Venezuela in there, which is not helping.
Which is a communist country,
right? You have to remember, Curacao is a very strategically well-placed island. It's the gateway to Venezuela. It's a stronghold. It could be a stronghold for any nation that would like to invade South America or vice versa. There's a huge refinery it's currently closed, but there's a lot of capability on the island that could be used by anybody.
An American Army base.
There is a small Army contingency. There's a small Navy contingency, and a little bit of Coast Guard from the States there. And that's what's holding things back for right now.
So the point of all of it is, Curacao is an incredibly innocent, happy.
Yes.
Everybody loved everybody, regardless of who you were or where you were from.
Yeah.
Island, and then the Black Panthers from the United States
Correct.
Came over and convinced everybody that they were being oppressed by the whites. Got them riled up to the point that they destroyed their own city and their own livelihoods.
Right.
Allowed the Communist Party to swoop in, and they've never been the same since.
That's correct.
Okay. Do you see similarities to what's going on here?
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I hadn't thought about all of this in a very long time, many years. It was very traumatic for me when it was happening then. But we moved to the States eventually, and I forgot about it all. And so I'm watching on TV what's going on now, the looting and such, and I'm looking at that, and immediately I'm thrown back to 1968.
And the Black Lives Matter, and how much everything they're saying is just like what the Black Panthers said.
And that's the weird thing. A lot of what's being said now was being said in 68 over there.
And it's on their heels are the communist parties.
Well, yes, and having studied history, that is how that works.
Yeah, that's something else that's not being taught is actual history. But
there is there is a progression that the socialist/communist movement follows, and they have stuck to that pretty stringent with wherever they've gone, and they're trying to do that here in the States now.
And that is?
Well, you create a feeling of unrest and ill will where there wasn't none to begin with.
Divide and conquer.
And then once that's there, then you capitalize on that by doing exactly what they're doing, and that's making the people feel that it's their right to take over because you deprived me all these years of whatever. And even though that may not have nothing to, that will have nothing to do with the actual truth.
So they made people hate each other within, as in divide and conquer.
Correct.
And then they swoop in and they take over and they destroy. They take all the power and oppress everybody.
That's correct.
And that is what communism is.
Absolutely. And we know the end goal is as long as you keep dividing and conquering and dividing and conquering, eventually you have no choice but to, whoever is seemingly in power at that point is your Messiah. You're the guy that you go for because he's going to make it all right.
But he doesn't, does he?
No, he doesn't. He can't.
He, she, or it. Because right now we've got some women out there that are very vocal communists.
But it always points to one. It's a pyramid scheme. It always points to one person at the top eventually.
So, in essence, to boil it all down, communism is basically Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme.
Yes, but not as nice.
But not as nice, because there's a lot of murder and torture and things that go on.
And that's by necessity, because you have to rule the ones that don't mind getting ruled by you or are too scared to fade away. And the ones that do fight you have to eliminate.
Right. Now let me ask you something real quick, because I just want to toss this in here. You and your family came to the United States in 1970.
Correct.
You came here legally.
Yes.
How long did it take before the United States would approve your immigration?
So I was born in 53. 52, I'm sorry. In 53, my family put themselves on the list to come to the United States.
So you had to wait from 1953 until 1970 until your name came up to the top of the waiting list to be approved to come to the United States.
That's correct.
Because the United States still has, but isn't necessarily enforcing, a policy that only a certain number of people from each country are allowed to come. And your parents, even though you were living in Curacao, were considered Indonesians and you had to wait.
Correct. Because and it was a quota system. Depending on what nation you're listed as your home nation, or where you were born, in our case it was Indonesia, depending on how the United States would see that country as either friendly or non-friendly, or communist or not communist, they would allow only so many in.
And since Indonesia had turned into, during the years you were in Curacao, had turned into a communist country.
That's correct.
It didn't matter that you guys were living in Curacao. They were considered Indonesian.
That is correct.
So you had to wait 18 years.
And even then, I remember my father back in 64, 65, had to come to the United States. Came to Florida, and at the request of a pastor who he had met, a pastor who was in Florida that he had met some years earlier in Curacao. And with that pastor, my dad went out and found somebody that was willing to sign and saying, yes, this man will have a job when he comes to the States.
And a home.
And a home. Well, the church had to vouch for the fact that they would have a home available. They found a landlord who was willing to rent to us when we got here.
And that was in 1964?
65, yes.
65. But you weren't allowed to come until 1970.
That is correct.
So you had to have a sponsor,
yep,
a guarantee of a job,
yep,
a guarantee of a home,
yep,
and you had to wait 18 years.
Yep.
But you did it, and you came here legally. And when you got here,
yes,
what did you have to prove?
I had to prove that I could speak English. I had to prove that
fluently.
Yes.
Read and write it.
Read and write it. I had to eventually, not at that time, but 5 years later, I had to prove that I had basic knowledge of American history and American civics.
And Constitution.
We actually went through a
Winston.
Through a little exam that all of us had to take individually with an immigration examiner. And if you passed, then you got given your citizenship papers.
So you had to go through a lot to come here.
Yeah.
But you did everything that you were asked to do.
Absolutely.
And you got a job right away.
Yes.
All of you did. Everybody that was over 18 in your family
yes,
got a job.
Absolutely, yes.
And you've worked every day of your life since.
I have.
And you're 67.
Unfortunately, yes, I am.
No, it's better than the alternative. But there's never been a day in your life that you haven't worked.
No.
And there's never been a day in your life you've taken any kind of welfare.
No, I'm not.
Even when things were tough.
No, because you find a way to make it work.
Right. Okay. Well, I just wanted to get your side of it because you are a legal immigrant. You've seen both sides. And you grew up in a country where Pink Panthers, the Black Panthers, and the communist country actually destroyed the innocence and the tranquility of a peaceful,
it's what they do.
unracist island. Okay, that's what I wanted. Thank you very much.